Hi, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank Danny for joining us. I'm going to introduce him in a moment, although I think that he probably does not need introduction for most people. So thanks for joining us on this Americans for Peace Now webinar. I'm Ori Nir. We're discussing today a current affair, the current flare-up in Israeli-Palestinian relations, particularly in Jerusalem. We'll dive into it in a moment. Before we do, as usual, the housekeeping comments. So I'm reminding you that the webinar is being recorded. A video recording will be posted on YouTube, on our YouTube channel later today, and then the audio recording will become an episode on our podcast, Peacecast, along with a written transcript. I'm also reminding you that you're encouraged to ask questions, and as you know, you do that by using the Q&A tool that's on the bottom left side of your screen. Just type in your question and try to keep your questions short. As I said, our guest today is probably familiar to most of you, if not all. We've had him on many times before, and we typically call on his expertise when Jerusalem is on fire. So Daniel, or Danny Zeidman, is an Israeli attorney specializing in Israeli-Palestinian relations, with an emphasis on Jerusalem. He's the founder and director of Terrestrial Jerusalem, a nonprofit organization that works toward the resolution a resolution to the question of Jerusalem that would be consistent with a two-state solution. Danny is perhaps the expert on Israeli-Palestinian relations in Jerusalem. He's also he has an outstanding ability to connect the dots from Jerusalem to other components of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to do that today. So with this introduction, thank you, Danny, for joining us.
My pleasure, as always.
So it's kind of hard to tell where to start, and we were discussing it before we went on air. But maybe I'll ask you this, Danny. How is this Passover different when we compare it to last year, to last May? And why is it that this time of year, spring, is so volatile in Jerusalem? So there are two questions there, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to remind everybody that this year is not over, and we're in the thick of things. And this reminds me of my days in the IDF when there would be a high alert and all leaves are canceled. My leave has been canceled. I follow the news literally all the time. And regrettably, there's always something to follow. So the final word has not been said, but we can say some tentative things. Let's start with last year. Last year, Jerusalem was the trigger of convulsive violence and a round of violence, the like of which we had not seen for a number of years. Thousands of rockets exchanged, massive devastation in Gaza. And of course, not only clashes and intercommunal clashes in Jerusalem, but in the mixed cities in Israel, among the Palestinian citizens of Israel, in ways that we have not seen. Certainly not since the first few days of the second Intifada in 2000. And the question is, why did that happen? And my best estimate would be that there were two radioactive issues in this conflict which were in play simultaneously. Most of the issues between Israelis and Palestinians are territorial ones, and we're one to divide the land equitably between an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. We'd be able to address most of the core grievances, but there are two issues that are not. They're identity issues, and they cut to the core of the identity of the Jewish people and the Palestinians. one of which is Jerusalem, especially the holy sites in Jerusalem, and the other is displacement and the fear of displacement. Both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people have refugees as their formative experience in terms of national consciousness. Every Jewish family is a refugee family, and every Palestinian has been affected by Nakba. And these cut to the core of the identities of Israelis and Palestinians. And last year, simultaneously, we had poked our finger into both of these issues simultaneously. There was the imminent fear of displacement, large-scale displacement, the likes of which we had not witnessed since 1967 in Sheikh Jarrah. There were court hearings approaching, and there was a pending sense of disaster, and there were demonstrations and clashes all the time. And secondly, there was the erosion of the status quo on Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, al-Aqsa. That's a subject in and of itself. But to be succinct, the core of any interpretation of status quo is that Muslims pray on the Temple Mount, non-Muslims visit the Temple Mount. I am quoting one of the people I admire most, one of my heroes, our former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was coerced into saying those words. And over the years, especially in the waning days of Netanyahu, that became a fiction. And the police turned a blind eye. And it wasn't a secret. The Temple Mount movement was chirping it from the rooftops to an extent that I think it was fair to say that the status quo collapsed. Now, this is something that was joined by what I would call the Bantan is shrinking the conflict. Well, in Jerusalem, we're shrinking the Palestinians, or at least we're shrinking Palestinian space. So the safe space of Haram al-Sharif became less safe and more contested, but also the place where kids would hang out after prayers at Damascus Gate became an area of contention and conflict and things of that nature. So when you put all of those elements together, you got a perfect storm. Now, Jerusalem was not the explosive device of this, it was the detonator. And it ignited a conflict that was broader than that. And to a certain extent, the trajectory of the conflict was determined on the one hand in Gaza and on the other on the streets of Israel. What is different this year? Well, in some ways, nothing, but only in some ways. So the underlying issues remain. There are more than 100 families subject to eviction proceedings in Sheikh Jarrah, more than 80 in Silwan, and this is a scope that we have not witnessed since 1967. The status quo is still challenged. There is a new page that has been opened between Israel and Jordan, but as we can see, it has not been able to sustain this crisis very well. And that remains, and you do have the sense of a shrinking Palestinian space. Having said that, there are a number of differences. Number one, the big difference is everybody remembers last year. So I recall sending off messages, I can say it openly, to Washington in March and April of last year saying, guys, I'm not an alarmist, but I can smell the volatile gases. Jerusalem is on the brink of an explosion. And these were the beginning days of a new administration, and it didn't elicit the kind of response that was difficult getting attention, partially because there were so many people who were awaiting appointment. I'm not here to, criticize anybody. That's not a problem getting attention this year. Everybody's been paying attention. And with the good Lord's sense of humor, created a calendar in which you will have Pesach, Passover, Easter, and Ramadan coinciding. That's a good sense of humor. And that by the way, that's been helpful in the sense that it's gotten a lot of attention. That's something that Jerusalem knows how to do. I mean, you have the 1 square kilometer of the old city, and Jews, Muslims, and Christians have holidays all the time. But in periods of tension, it becomes highly, highly problematic. And that was anticipated. And there have been a lot of people in very senior places in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, the United States, who've been paying attention to this. And that has made a difference. If there has been violence, it is not because the subject did not receive attention. And finally, something that's been very much underestimated. There's been a court verdict in 4 cases, out of hundreds, but 4 cases by the Israeli Supreme Court, which surprised everybody in that it not only ruled largely in favor of the Palestinians, but it was a very courageous and substantive verdict. It will be a precedent for another 10, 15 cases, but it's also an indication of a willingness to take these difficult subjects and to deal with them seriously in ways that we have not seen an Israeli court do in the past. I'm mentioning that because once that verdict was handed down and the atmosphere was, it's a lost cause, nothing will come of it, you could feel a palpable reduction in the level of tension. I go to Sheikh frequently now, as we would go out in years past, you, Ori, and APN groups. You couldn't do that 3 months ago because things were so tense and it was barricaded and shut down. It looked like Belfast at its worst. No. So we entered this, from my perception, without the white hot rage that I sensed a year ago. Still, we have encountered serious violence. It has created a crisis between Israel and our allies in the Arab world. Things are and remain tense. As I said, I think the worst may be behind us for technical reasons that we perhaps talk about shortly. There have been clashes, violence, but with the exception of 2 rockets that were sent apparently by rogue organizations, it has not spread. It has not spread to the West Bank, although things remain tense there. It has not spread to the cities in Israel, for the most part. There have been some demonstrations and things of that nature. So I would say, same in that the underlying causes remain and that the clashes have been there and are still dangerous, but it is not as dire a circumstance as we saw a year ago. We have challenges before us. War on Saturday. Everybody's been paying close attention to Jews and Muslims, and the poor Christians, unfortunately, are not as violent as either of us, so nobody pays much attention to them. But it's Easter week, and Saturday there is the ceremony of the fire in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre under the auspices of the Greek Orthodox Church. And there's a major crisis between Israel and the churches regarding access to that. So it ain't over yet.
Thanks, Danny. I want to remind everyone that you're welcome to ask questions using the Q&A tool that's on the bottom left of your screen. Danny, I wanted to ask you a bit about something that seems to me different, maybe just in terms of the quantity. And I wanted to quote to you some numbers that I've seen issued by the Minhelet HaKotel or Minhelet Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount administration, authority, whatever it's called. I don't know what. Anyway, so they keep tabs of the number of Jews who come to visit and do, in fact, pray, as you pointed out, on the Temple Mount. And the numbers that I've seen, this is from yesterday, during the first 3 days following the Passover holiday, 2,275 Jews visited the Temple Mount. On the fourth day, this is yesterday, 1,538. This is more than any other day in the history since 1967, according to their count. So the total since the Seder is 3,813 people. How does it measure to past years, and what is the impact of those visits on the atmosphere, the tension surrounding the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif?
There are the quantitative changes and there are the qualitative changes in the interrelationship between the two. I mentioned in the pithy sentence of our former prime minister, Muslims pray, non-Muslims visit. But it goes beyond that. I think that we're one to describe, and there are different interpretations of the status quo, and many of them in good faith, and some of them, a lot of them not, but regardless. The status quo means that the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif al-Aqsa is exclusively a Muslim place of worship that is open to the respectful and dignified visits of non-Muslims in coordination with the Waqf, and in a way that is compatible with the decorum of the site.
And Danny, just maybe explain Waqf, what Waqf is. So people
Waqf is the Islamic endowment, which is basically the owner and controller of the Temple Mount. It's the Islamic endowment. It is run by Jordan, but incorporates Palestinian groups, the PA. It also has representatives all from East Jerusalem, but you will have a Turkish East Jerusalemite and an Emirati East Jerusalemite. And Israel has in large part recognized in the past the autonomy of the Waqf, which has been part of the status quo, and that has been undermined and neglected in recent years and has not been restored since the beginning of the new Bennett government. In the past, there would be limitations of groups of 20 and 30 individuals. What started as a fringe group in 1967, Jewish prayer was forbidden and continues to be forbidden by an overwhelming majority of Orthodox rabbis. But it became, from a lunatic fringe, it became a fringe, and from fringe, it became mainstream. And today, it is widely accepted that this is one of the foundations, Jewish visits and prayer to a certain extent, of the ideological right in Israel. And official Israel gained much more tolerant towards that. The numbers are part of it. If you want to understand from the perspective of a Muslim, these people are supposed to be coming in as our guests. Well, we should be able to decide how many guests, number one. But beyond that, they walk around as if they're, balabatim, they're the landlords, they're the proprietors. Many of them do not just hide their disdain and contempt for Islam on the site. It's sort of like somebody walking into your home as a guest and then taking out a tape measure and measuring the windows for saying, we're making the drapes because, we're not threatening you with eviction now, but give us a little while, you'll be gone. Okay, and that is clearly a sense that a place that was theirs, in which they were hosting others, is now under threat. Now, there is a good deal of paranoia involved in this at some time, but there's also genuine fears, and some of them are not unfounded. Example of the paranoia, the goat. The goat. For years, the wackier branch of the Temple Mount movement would say, we're going to sacrifice a goat on the Temple Mountain. And they actually, and were never allowed near the Temple Mount because everybody knows that this would be an instant holy war. Leave, the goat aside. Actually, they went so far as carrying out a sacrifice in an empty lot in West Jerusalem a year or two ago. Well, this year they announced it, and actually the Israeli government handled it really well. It's not only they said, we're not going to do it. They handed out military orders that, they're not allowed near the place, and they made preemptory arrests. Didn't matter. The distrust among Israelis and Palestinians is such that convincing many Palestinians that Israel has no intention to slaughter the goat on Haram al-Sharif, to the Temple Mount, is like going into rural Alabama and convincing the local Republican Party that Biden won the election. Some of these are good people. They're fine, but they latched onto fake news, and nothing will disavow them of it. Even when Israel does, as in this case, everything right. To a certain extent, what we've witnessed in this round is the core issues between Israelis and Palestinians in general, and particularly in Jerusalem, have been neglected for years. Palestinian East Jerusalem is being shattered and fragmented by Israeli policies. There is zero political horizon, very little hope. The status quo has been eroded, and then a crisis erupts, and you find that nobody trusts each other. And even if you do everything right, it's not going. You're in a situation where doing everything right is not going to be sufficient because of the years of problematic policies and neglect. Add to that a problematic police department. I think that police violence is a major problem throughout Israel. In many ways, the police have some of the trappings of a rogue militia, and nowhere is this more the case than vis-a-vis the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, who the police systematically treat as enemy. This is a situation that was developed over years and cannot be reversed overnight. We have a decent minister of security, internal security, Omer Bar-Lev. But you have incident after incident of gratuitous violence being caught on camera of innocent people, including children, including women, including the disabled, including press, being assaulted unprovoked by the police. And there's nobody in official Israel who's spoken out on that. No, they are operating behind the scenes to do something, but if the head of the Jerusalem Police Department is asked about this and says, well, they're the bad apples, we'll handle them. No, this is not a bad apple. There's systemic violence here. It's not everybody, but you need, and if you say to the Israeli public, you're doing the right things policy-wise, you say to the world, the status quo is being maintained, everything's fine, you lose all credibility. And if you allow for police violence to go unchecked, and I'm making no apologetics for the violence and the difficult situation they're in, they're encountering violence as well, but that does not justify gratuitous police brutality towards innocent people. So all of these have contributed to the tensions. On the most part, for the most part, the events have been contained at a tolerable level. Look, do not have a war with Gaza. We don't have rioting on the streets of East Jerusalem and the cities of Israel. And we've not had any serious injuries or fatalities. So could be worse.
Thanks, Danny. There are several questions that are being asked in the Q&A regarding the issue of the status quo. What is the status quo and so on? So maybe a quick kind of historic, if you don't mind. It doesn't have to be comprehensive, just to give us a context of what the status quo is. Please, when you talk about it, answer the question of, is it actually illegal for Jews to pray on the Temple Mount? And then in that context, we have a couple of questions that have to do with why actually, if it's not illegal, legally, in terms of the actual law, why not? Why shouldn't Jews pray in the place that is the most sacred to Jews in the world? There's a question here regarding Hebron. Regarding the Hebron model, why can't we apply the model of the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron to the Temple Mount and have, all faiths praying there? I hope you can remember all these. If not, I'll add more later. Start with those.
I can rely on you. Yes.
Okay.
Let me start from the end. I'm going to be a bit snarky, but I would never am. But I would say, obviously, anybody who holds up the Tomb of the Patriarchs, the Ibrahim Mosque, as a paradigm of coexistence is either never visited Hebron or is smoking something. Nothing personal. It is the most toxic holy site on the planet. There is zero coexistence. It is brutal occupation, but also the most toxic relations between the religions. And it's an important question because it is the fear, one of the major fears of Palestinians, that this model will be implemented on the Temple Mount. It's called a temporal division, that there will be times of the day that it's a Jewish holy site and times of the day it will be a Muslim holy site. No Israeli government has entertained that prospect seriously. It is not sustainable, it will not work, and it will lead to bloodshed. It is possible, though, that on the ground, that kind of temporal division actually could be taking shape, and the Palestinians in that regard are not being paranoid. Let me go back, okay? And one can almost trace the status quo to the third day of the 1967 war, when Moshe Dayan, who had grave doubts about taking the old city in the first place, he didn't want to. He said, who the hell needs these Vaticans? Was his quote. He arrived 4 hours after the mount was taken by Israeli paratroopers, saw Israeli flags flying from the mosques and barked, take those down and never put them up again. We do not need a holy war. That is considered by many to be the wisest decision made after 1967 by the ideological right in Israel. It's considered to be the biggest blunder after 1967. That's one of the chasms, the fault lines in Israeli society today. The approach was, in order for Israel to maintain its vital interests and its legitimacy as ruler of Jerusalem, we annexed East Jerusalem, we have to treat the holy sites, both of Islam and Christianity, as a trust and a precious deposit, and we have to treat it with reverence and self-restraint. And that immediately translated itself into recognition of the autonomy of the Waqf, the Islamic endowment. The keys to the gates, 10 in number, sometimes one shuts down the other, but more or less 10, one set of keys for the Mughrabi gate were in Israeli hands, the other in the Waqf. And it was basically a recognition that the Waqf would be able to conduct matters on Haram al-Sharif, and specifically in regard to prayer. Now, before I get into what is wrong with, I would like to point out that there are a number of marginal Israelis who have been adamant in refusing to allow any Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. Those marginal Israelis are Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, Ehud Barak, Ariel Sharon, Benjamin Netanyahu, the original and the sequel, Ehud Olmert, all of Israeli prime ministers have opposed Jewish prayer on the Mount. Now, you will hear, what's wrong with it? Shucks, the Temple Mount movement or Rosa Parks being forced to the back of the bus. Well, the Temple Mount, our Temple Mount, has been exclusively a Muslim place of worship for 1,300 years, with the exception of a minor and regrettable incident called the Crusades. Jews since the 12th century have forbidden ascent, Jewish ascent, much less prayer to the Temple Mount. We never, requested it. The Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif was closed to non-Muslims until the mid-19th century, and in which the arrangement was opened up. Can you imagine, a local synagogue saying, okay, we're going to have guests, but all of a sudden we changed our minds, we want to pray here, or Chabad opening up a minyan in St. Peter's Square. Come on, right to pray everywhere. Little known fact. Can Muslims pray at the Western Mall of world? No, they can't. Can they visit? Yeah. If they're from Malaysia, they can visit. If they're from Egypt, they can visit. If they're from Ramallah or Bethlehem, they can't because they can't get into Jerusalem. And if they are Palestinians from East Jerusalem, they are not allowed inside the Western Wall Plaza. Full stop. It's not a question of security. They're turned back. No, there's an exception. The disabled can get a pedestrian permit. You have a driver's license, a pedestrian permit. So some of the infirm are allowed to go through. So now, final point, there is a Talmudic saying, Lo harva Yerushalayim ela mipnei shedanu badin Torah. Jerusalem was destroyed because of the overzealous application of the rule of the Torah. Okay, this is an example about invoking the freedom of religion in somebody else's holy site, which has a tradition and patterns that have been hallowed for millennia, and the people who are visiting happen to be occupiers, and the people who are being coerced into this are occupied. No, we don't want to do that.
We referred to Hebron earlier, and we have an interesting question coming. Are we witnessing the Hebronization of Jerusalem, particularly in the sense of the dominance of extremist Jews in this case, the Kahanists who are so dominant in Hebron? What do you think?
Mostly no, partially yes. Okay. Look, Jerusalem isn't Hebron in the sense that I can go out and around with groups, Israelis, Jews, etc., through much of East Jerusalem in circumstances that were I or we in Hebron, we would have to be accompanied by a battalion of Israeli troops. There is no such thing as coexistence in Hebron, none. I mean, and I don't think that there will be until the settlers are extracted from the heart of Hebron. We have seen signs, troubling signs of relations that are similar to Hebron emerging in Jerusalem. I think that that is what we witnessed prior to the court verdict in Sheikh Jarrah, where basically you're seeing a conflict going back. We're kicking the hornet's nest of 1948 by doing a Nakba reenactment in Sheikh Jarrah, and we're returning the conflict to the streets of Jerusalem, just as we had in January, March, and April of 1948. But the moment that the immediate cause of that, the imminent fear of displacement, was removed by the court verdict, it's calmed down. Where is this analogy correct? We have been witnessing over many years, and accelerated even under this new government, what I call the weaponization of faith. The ascendancy of faith communities whose claims to Jerusalem are exclusionary, absolute, and often incendiary. And among the Jews, this is the large parts of the Temple Mount movement and the settlers of East Jerusalem with their biblical aspirations and displacement of Palestinians. Among Muslims, it's the various iterations of the Brotherhood. And among Christians, it is the end of days evangelicals who make the settlers and the Brotherhood look tame. For years, you've been following this for years with me, or that I've been saying, these guys, they're becoming more powerful. Well, under Trump and Netanyahu, they weren't more powerful, they have the power. Or can you think of any two individuals on the planet who are less pious, less men of faith than Trump and Netanyahu? Men of faith they are not. On the other hand, during their reign, I will use the term, policy in Washington was driven by the rapture mongers like Pence and Pompeo, and in Jerusalem were driven by the settlers in the Temple Mount movement. And in that sense, and we're seeing it in the relations with the churches. We have marginalized the traditional establishments and allowed for the religious pyromaniacs to control the discourse and sometimes the course of events. And that is indeed reminiscent of what's happening in Hebron.
I want to go back to an issue that you discussed kind of briefly earlier, and that is the police reaction and police behavior. I remember very well some very sensitive police chiefs in Jerusalem, Arya Amit, Miki Levy, Yoram Alevi, and others who were really, very sensitive about what's happening on the Temple Mount. We see a, to put it very mildly, insensitive attitude or policy recently. Do you think that's what it is? Is it just a kind of an insensitivity that comes from above? Is it something else? Is it more of a systemic issue of Israel police writ large that we've seen inside Israel proper as well? How would you define it?
Well, first of all, I think your description is entirely correct. I mean, 10 years ago, and for many years, I would say that the police on the Temple Mount were the moderating influence. I mean, they understood it better than anybody. I mean, I once had a cab driver take me to the airport who had been the police commander of the Temple Mount and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at various times, and regaled me with stories. What this guy forgot the government of Israel has never learned. That changed. And that changed under Netanyahu, and particularly our dear ambassador to the United Nations, Erdogan, where the police became partisan.
Just to explain, Erdogan used to be the Minister of Internal
Affairs, and you know, in bed with the Temple Mount movement, turning a blind eye, and they forfeited that role. I mean, and part of it is, 10 years ago, people knew if you are a police commander on the Mount and something goes wrong, your career goes up in smoke. And now, if you displease the Temple Mount movement, your career goes up in smoke. Well, that's part of it. I think that our minister is aware of that. I think that some of the police command are aware of it, not sufficiently. You know, when Bennett makes an announcement in the current context, we're giving the security forces a free hand to deal with disturbances. He may have meant to deal with the terror in Tel Aviv, which is understandable, but it's heard on the Temple Mount, and there's no restraint. It goes deeper than that. Occupation requires ever increasing repressive measures in order to sustain itself. And that means that what we're witnessing is a function of policy, but it has a DNA of its own. Occupation is no longer policies of a government. It has become the DNA of official Israel. The policeman at the Damascus Gate doesn't need marching orders in order to beat up a Palestinian kid for no reason whatsoever. It comes naturally. It is the equivalent of settler violence, and it's the equivalent to the blind eye that the IDF and the police in the West Bank, you know, have towards settler violence. This is not the kind of thing that changes overnight, but it's also not the kind of thing that will go away on its own, and requires political courage and very deft and wise command from both the political echelon and within the police to change it. I'm seeing some indications of that beginning, but it has not looked good over the last 10 days.
I think that's a really important observation that you just made, how the occupation has become a part of the DNA in Israel, and it manifests itself in so many ways, and this is one of them. We have a lot of questions that have to do with solutions. What can be done to both, you know, lower the flames, to perhaps create a different dynamic, recreate a different dynamic. One aspect of this that I wanted to ask you about, particularly, again, something that I've witnessed and covered in the past as a journalist, was the whole issue of communications, the channels of communications between the various actors, if you will, or stakeholders, and that includes the government of Jordan. How in your understanding, how is that working today? Are there such channels? Are they effective? But beyond that, what other things can be done to both lower the flames and maybe create different, more positive dynamics in Jerusalem, and particularly on the Temple Mount?
The most important thing is to realize that the channels of communication collapsed under Netanyahu in the waning days, not in the waning years. I used to give Netanyahu very good grades for acting responsibly on the Mount, and that began to change in 2017 on, and for the last, and it became increasingly worse. It was a breakdown of communication between Netanyahu and the king. There was much bad blood there. But it went beyond that. It was, you had 2 billionaire kids playing dice with the universe, MBZ and Kushner, in legion with Netanyahu, tinkering with the idea of diluting the Jordanian presence, even hints of a palace coup, but certainly looking for a role for the Saudis or the Emiratis. To be honest, both the Biden administration and Bennett came in with scorched earth. And it had been many years before there were good relations. The relations basically never recovered after the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000. That will not change overnight. There was a new leaf turned between Israel and Jordan, although I think both leaderships were kind of terrified about taking this on. It's just such a difficult issue. Israel maintains the fiction created or purveyed by Trump. Jerusalem's off the table. So there is a reluctance to suggest that maybe other stakeholders have a say in what's going on here. The relations between Israeli security and Jordanian security are good, but not in the intimate kind of relations that existed in the past, which would allow common problem solving. And Jordan and Israel aren't enough. You have to triangulate. The people who live here aren't Jordanians. They're Palestinian. I recall with nostalgia the end of the 1990s when there would be disturbances on the Mount, and there were disturbances on the Mount. The security would weigh in and handle it very deftly. Which security? Job's people. They were conducting security on the Mount in coordination with us. They did it much better than we could. The opportunity created with a new government, a new administration, was squandered. Secretary Kerry, whatever one thinks about how he fulfilled his role in the Middle East, did a masterful job on the Temple Mount. He would spend hours weekly on the phone with the King Abdullah and Netanyahu. I would rather spend hours in root canal. I mean, he deserves a medal just for having done that. And there would be a pattern that there would be a crescendo of tension towards, and he would always pull us back from the brink. Nobody fulfilled that role. And by the way, I was telling people somebody has to fill that void. We can't do this on our own. And Israel's reluctant to do that. As matters stand, I think that this past week hopefully will give people pause to think this can't be neglected. Quietly behind the scenes, this needs hands-on daily crisis prevention, crisis containment, crisis management, but also engagement at the highest levels. Some of this has to be done publicly to re-educate the public regarding the fact that nobody has a monopoly on the sanctity of Jerusalem. On the one hand, but much of it has to be quiet and discreet without there being magic bullets. I think this could be a potential turning point in the creation of opportunity because the consequences of neglecting this, you can see, are daunting.
We have a question here. I'm looking at the clock. We still have some time regarding the American aspect, and more specifically, to what extent are the religious extremists and expansionist settlers Americans, and to what extent are they funded by evangelical Americans?
Look, I think that you would probably find American Jews from who made Aliyah from the United States to be modestly overrepresented in movements such as these. I think today most of the Aliyah comes from Orthodox and nationalistic Orthodox background, which was not the case in, I was the very end of the Aliyah in the wake of the '67 war. I made Aliyah in 1973, which was the tail end. But I would not describe this as an American phenomenon. There are elements of, just as APN has its interrelationships with folks like us on the ground here, there are relationships between right-wing organizations, the American Jewish community. In terms of the material support, look, it's there. No, this is an Israeli production. The funding and support is of the government of Israel. I mean, the Temple Mount movement, hosts tours of school children in their Temple Mount Museum, showing them the vessels of the temple and sacrifice and things of that nature. There is funding that goes to the extreme settler organizations in East Jerusalem, minor funds like $100 billion by Roman Abramovich, the Russian oligarch. I think that the support, the significance of the support coming from the end of days evangelicals, not all evangelicals, perhaps a majority, but not all of them, is the political support and the political clout that they wield within the Republican Party, and not so much the material support.
Okay. Again, looking at the clock, I'm going to relate to a few questions that we have here. One of them that I can answer for you, and if you want to add anything, then you're welcome. Isn't the best solution the end of the occupation? The answer is yes. Next question. The next question is great.
The occupation has to be done correctly. Okay.
Exactly. The next question is great because it comes with a PS, and the PS, I'm not making this up, Danny, you're gonna love this. I am a dentist, and really, root canals are not usually such a bad experience, says the participant.
I stand corrected, but I do not withdraw the point I was trying to make about conversations with Netanyahu.
But her question is interesting, and the question is, what kind of an effect had the moving of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem? And maybe in that context, you may want to say a few words about the issue of the consulate that is a kind of an ongoing issue. So maybe I'll ask you this, and I'll ask you one other question, and that is, are there any leaders in Israel, or anyone that is of any substance, any significance, who are trying to move the needle away from the extremists, not only among Jews actually, but also among the Arabs, among the Palestinians? So you have two questions there.
All right. If I were to treat the Trump plan, especially as it pertains to Jerusalem, as a piece of literature, I would summarize it as follows. It entails the fragmentation of Palestinian East Jerusalem economically, geographically, socially, and the denationalization of the Palestinians and the marginalization of Christian and Muslim equities. That is the Trump plan. And it's not accidental because those were the policies that were put in play by Netanyahu and fleshed out by the Trump plan. And the move of the embassy disclosed that Jerusalem is off the table. Israeli lives matter, Palestinian lives matter less. I had a fair amount of engagement with decision makers in the Trump administration, and their position was one of the diminished humanity of Palestinians. When I would talk to them about occupation, they weren't disagreeing with me. They didn't know what the hell I was talking about. Because occupation is natural. I told them in advance, move the embassy, Jerusalem will remain conflicted, and it has. It will remain binational, and it is. It will remain divided, and it is. It will marginalize the United States, and it has marginalized the United States and disqualified it as fair broker. I said I don't detect the white hot rage that I detected a year ago, but I do detect the despair. A Palestinian kid, how can he imagine a trajectory in which he comes out under the thumb of Israel and has the ability to shape his own life within his own people? They can't imagine a way out of this. The fact that the United States has not fulfilled a promise made by the president and the vice president is an indication Palestinian lives still don't matter enough. And yes, we will get tea and sympathy from this administration, but they haven't gone the distance in saying we recognize that the Palestinian equities in Jerusalem parallel those of Israelis. Now, there's a world of difference between the administrations, their sensitiveness, and that we're living in a world of realpolitik. But there is a relationship and a correlation between the destabilization of Jerusalem and the marginalization of Palestinian Christian and Muslim equities. I have no doubt about it.
Thanks, Danny. Let's see. We have some really big questions that I think are not like someone is asking what happened to the Israeli left, why is it losing power, and so on. And I think it's too big of too big of an issue to get into. But one question that I think is kind of interesting. Someone is asking, how is all of this being received or perceived by the Israeli public? Are people, do they care about it? Do they pay attention? Is it something that moves people? Are they concerned?
It's a difficult question to answer. It dovetails with one of the prior questions about who are engaging on these issues. There is nobody in the political arena in Israel that is prioritizing this issue. The political discourse from within the political arena is dominated by the Israeli right. There is no significant pushback geopolitically from anybody. And I include what parades itself as the Israeli left. The Palestinian political parties, you will find the humanitarian dimension of this being highlighted. It is remarkable to see, the perception is that Israelis are the victims on the Temple Mount, that the Jordanians and the Palestinians are violating the status quo. And this from moderate voices. I mean, we've allowed ourselves to slide into a parallel universe. There are other voices. Number one, I think that the leadership, the breath of fresh air, the Arab political lists, which are addressing the Israeli public in ways that we have never seen in the past. That's a positive development, although they cannot possibly take the lead on this. I know their goal is to have their share of Israeli society in a way that's compatible with a Palestinian national identity, not to end occupation. They can't hold that flag high. You will see increasing numbers within civil society in Israel expressing concerns about this. The generals, the commanders for Israel security are the courageous voice in Israel today, talking about the perils of occupation and the danger that it entails. But we desperately need to hear from our friends. And I have to add something. We're not getting a lot of help from certain quarters in the ideological left. There are those elements, and certainly not all, but those hours among progressives, who have given up on addressing the Israeli public, who've given up on engaging Israeli authorities. And this conflict will be resolved by declaring Israel an apartheid state and bludgeoning us into submission. So those of us on the ground, and I certainly would include Shalom Achshav, who are among the most important of these that are highlighting, exposing, challenging occupation, our numbers have diminished, not only because the discourse has shifted rightward, but because certain elements in the ideological left are too busy writing manifestos.
Okay, so we have reached the top of the hour. I always say at the end of these webinars that they're probably the best manifestation of how fast 1 hour can go. But this was really, really interesting, Dani. I want to thank you very much and to wish you Chag Sameach, a happy holiday. We have the second holiday of Passover.
Chag Sameach, happy Easter, Ramadan Kareem, and greetings to all others.
Thanks, Dani. I want to thank everyone who joined us today on this webinar. Answering the question that we had in the Q&A, yes, this is recorded. It is going to be posted on our podcast, Peacecast, and also on our YouTube channel. Sometime later today. I took down all the questions that were asked. There were many questions there that actually deserve a good answer, and I'm going to try to find a way to address them, maybe with Dani's help later on. And again, wanted to thank everyone for joining. This concludes our webinar for today. Bye, everyone.